Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the final of my 4 conversations with Luke Kemp about societal collapse. We have done the ancient past, we have done the recent past, we have done the present, so now it's about the future. Where and when might collapse happen? Who will be responsible for it? Who or what are the agents of doom? Are they human or are they inhuman? And how can humans, we humans, fight back? Luke, we've come in many ways to the crunch of these conversations. This is part of a series called Where Are We Going? And we're going to be talking about how some of the dynamics we've been describing might play out in future. We left the last one with a 5-year time horizon. We're going to go a little beyond that. Might even ask you to put some probabilities on some outcomes. But I want to start with something that you said last time, which is about what's distinctive about the world we are in now. And the way you framed it is that essentially we live under a global Goliath. That's how you put it, a single overarching structure of power and authority and domination with lots of interleaved and interplaying aspects to it. Clearly, states are absolutely integral to this, including the most powerful states, particularly, but not exclusively. But that there are other actors who are part of the interlocking chain here, including, for instance, technology corporations. And others too, the big fossil fuel companies. In many ways, the whole world is subject to similar structures of power, even if some may be located in some places, some may be more subject to some jurisdictions than others. In that single global Goliath, and we'll talk in a bit about what might happen if the whole thing comes down, but let's park that for now. Where do you see the biggest danger to us coming from? And related to that, but it's a different question, which bits of it do you think are most vulnerable to collapse? So if the whole thing is not coming down, but we are talking about a structure of power which includes super powerful corporations, corporations that are far more powerful than most states have been in human history, as well as powerful states. Where's the threat and where's the vulnerability in that world?
Yeah, so I think I've mentioned earlier that when we talk about risk, we talk about different determinants. So the threats, the hazards, the vulnerability, the exposure, and the response. If you're looking at vulnerability, I would say that the big factor here is that the world is far more tightly coupled than it's ever been, meaning that a change in one system, one aspect, easily and quickly spills over into another. The second is the world is far more interdependent than it has been historically. And last but not least is that it's accelerating. It's getting quicker and quicker. I refer to this as the Death Star syndrome. Obviously harkening back to the very famous Star Wars film with the Death Star, this colossal weapon that seems almost indestructible, and yet you just hit it in the right spot, and suddenly, design flaw, the entire thing blows up. This goes back to some literature we have, which I mentioned around complex systems, that more big, interconnected complex systems tend to be really good at buffering in small shocks, but worse in terms of perpetuating big ones. And I think it's because of those 3 big factors: acceleration, interdependence, and tight coupling. In terms of the threats, these are what we usually refer to as existential or catastrophic risks. So things like global climate change, nuclear weapons, advanced AI systems, engineered pandemics. People like to bicker over which one of these is more important. To me, they're all fairly interconnected. Climate change, for instance, is likely to increase geopolitical conflict going into the future, which increases the risk that you're going to have something like a nuclear war. Similarly, AI systems, if they are hooked up into the command and control systems for nuclear weapons, is likely to exacerbate nuclear war, or simply if they upset the balance of power between great powers, could also trigger nuclear war. All of these things are interconnected. The bigger question for me is the exposure, or in this case, who's producing the threats. And this is where we end up really having to look at these big technological companies you mentioned, but also the fossil fuel industry and big defense contractors. I refer to the primary producers of global risk as the agents of doom. When you look at the production of existential risk, it's quite clear that there's a couple of patterns behind it. One is that it's highly concentrated among some of the most powerful and rich companies and countries in the world. So if we look at climate change, for instance, roughly 80% of emissions come from, this is cumulative global emissions, so cumulatively over history, roughly 80% come from 10 countries if you count the EU as one, and 25% come from just one, the US. If you look at it in terms of industrial emissions, since the signing of the Paris Agreement, roughly 80% of emissions come from just, I think, approximately 50 companies. If we look at nuclear weapons, 87% of the stockpiles held by two countries, the US and Russia. If we look in terms of companies, it's only about 24 companies are responsible for the maintenance and production of these weapons. If you're worried about advanced AI systems, you only really need to be looking at 3 companies: Anthropic, DeepMind, OpenAI, all of which are headquartered in the United States. The production of existential risk is highly concentrated, and the correlate here is that it's always very powerful, wealthy companies. The other factor is that they tend to operate in great secrecy. When it comes to nuclear weapons, obviously the Manhattan Project is synonymous with large secretive government program. When it comes to climate change, most of the fossil fuel companies knew about climate change back in the 1970s. Some even did internal modeling of how much temperature you get in response to doubling CO2 emissions. They noted in their own internal memos this was likely to wreak great devastation upon humanity, and they intentionally buried the information and ran disinformation campaigns financed for tens of millions of dollars. So across the board, these agents of doom are quite intentionally creating risk for everyone in exchange for private profit.
So what that analysis suggests to me, and you're going to have to correct me if I've misunderstood it, is that on the one hand, we are extremely vulnerable in ways that make our predicament different from many of the circumstances that we've described over that broad historical sweep, because our world is so interconnected and vulnerability in one part of the system could bring the whole system down. So one of the differences between us and even people who are living under the Roman Empire is that for us, the interconnection is genuinely global. There are very few places where we can go to escape from this. But on the other hand, within that tightly integrated universe, which is what it is, a kind of universal system, there are a very small number of players who are responsible for the risk. And if that's true, it suggests a couple of possible options. And I want you to tell me whether either of these two seem like a remedy for you. One of which is to uncouple those players from the total system. We could talk about how that might be possible, but just in broad conceptual terms. If the problem is it's too tightly integrated, but actually the responsibility is very narrowly focused, we have to work much harder to separate out that responsibility and indeed to identify the people who are lying behind it and somehow uncouple them from the system. But perhaps the stronger conclusion is that what we need is to find a way of having some of those agents of doom fail. Now, if we're talking here about collapse, societal collapse, this is an integrated system, so we're not talking about an individual society collapsing. We're trying to avoid the risk of the whole thing coming down. And yet we're also talking about a world where it's not simply states that have the power and the authority. It's also private corporations. And the thing that we haven't discussed to this point is private corporation failure and what that might mean. So I want to know whether actually what we should be hoping for is states to survive and the corporate agents of doom to fail, the defense contractors to fail, the big technology companies to fail. And this really does raise an acute question, which is whether that scenario would be comparable to the things that you've described. So say Meta or Alphabet go down in the way that the Babylonian emperor and the Babylonian Empire went down. Would that be a scenario in which we might end up better off, or would it take us down with them? Because that's the thing that hasn't happened yet in this story. We've had lots of examples of state failure. There are, of course, countless examples of corporate failure. Corporations fail every day, all the time. States are far more durable than corporations are. You said at the very beginning of our conversations that states are less durable than we think they are. Most of them actually don't last that long. But my God, they last a long time relative to corporations. And even the world's most powerful corporations now, they are babies. They are children compared to the world's most powerful states. They've only been around for a decade or 2 decades. Or that group you listed there at the end, OpenAI and Anthropic. We're not even talking a decade yet, barely. So I want to know, really want to try and think through what it would mean for the collapse that we've been talking about relative to states to refer to those other aspects of the global Goliath, the global Leviathan, which are these corporations. Do you think we could survive their collapse?
Would the world be a better place if Meta broke down? Probably, to be frank. Would it cause a societal collapse if we had all of the large surveillance capitalist firms go down together? Alphabet, Meta, Apple, etc. If I was a betting man, I'd say not. I think states are actually far more robust than that. It would certainly cause an economic financial crisis. It would certainly cause a drop in living standards for some people for a short period of time. I don't think it would be enough to actually halt the entire Goliath train. Hence, I think we're looking at something potentially much deeper here. And when we think about the Agents of Doom, one of the responses I commonly get is, well, don't hate the players, hate the game. Even if you got rid of the big defense contractors, Raytheon and Boeing, etc., or if you get rid of Meta, Alphabet, OpenAI, etc., they will just be replaced by another company that fills a very similar role. And in many ways, we've already seen this. OpenAI was actually started to balance against Google. There was a fear that Google's going too fast in AI, wasn't behaving in an appropriate manner, so OpenAI got created as a safe alternative. OpenAI didn't quite work out that way. It was probably worse than DeepMind in a whole bunch of ways. And so a bunch of people spun out into Anthropic to create a more safety-conscious outfit. And of course, Anthropic is now actually leading the race. It's worthwhile thinking about what are the structural incentives? What's the deeper drivers that are constantly creating this churn of companies, but also empires and states that are creating great global risk? Bear in mind that even if we got rid of the companies here, the nuclear stockpile is still held primarily by governments, primarily by the US and Russia. And likewise, even if we nationalized or renationalized in many cases fossil fuel companies, worth remembering most fossil fuel companies either are national endeavors like Saudi Aramco or Gazprom, or used to be, like in the case of British Petroleum and Dutch Royal Shell. Even if you renationalize them or in some way collapse them, that probably wouldn't solve the entire problem. The key question, once again, is what's driving all this? I refer to this as the root causes. And to me, this is potentially the most interesting question across history. If I was working at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk back in 1950, there's only one thing we're studying: nuclear weapons. That's essentially it. Today, suddenly we have people working in machine learning because of AI systems. We have people who are synthetic biologists working on engineered pandemics. We have people who have backgrounds in climatology, biodiversity to understand both climate change, but also the raft of different ecological problems we face. Why do we seem to be creating more and more risk, particularly as the world accelerates? It's complicated, but it goes back to these different forms of Goliath field that we spoke about earlier, and the darker angels of our nature, these psychological conditions that seem to select for not necessarily the best of us to go into positions of leadership. And I believe what that has done is it's shaped our institutions over time. When we think about states, for instance, and of course Hobbes framed it in a similar way, they are in many ways artificial agents, as are companies and corporations, and of course as AI systems today. But they also behave in a very particular kind of way, a way which I think leads to these problems like arms races, races for status, and races for resources that seem to be the drivers of our modern day problems. So if we look at either nuclear weapons or AI, the excuse that's always proffered by the CEOs, the generals, is if we don't do it, the bad guys will. Dario Modi's been frequently saying we have to develop these AI systems because we have to make sure democracies win first. And likewise, the US basically built up its arsenal on the back of two myths, the bomber and missile gap myth, essentially that Russia was surging ahead, both in its bombing capacity and its missile capacity. That actually wasn't the case. The US at the time had over 90% of the arsenal. But nonetheless, what we would call game theory seems to be the key problem here, collective action, if you will. The problem is that when you actually put them into laboratory settings, people often don't end up enacting a tragedy of the commons, an arms race, or a prisoner's dilemma. Often people are very good at communicating their way out of this. At an individual level, people don't seem to be the self-maximizing rational agents that we assume they are. Instead, they're actually usually much more worried about things like fairness, status, etc. There's two exceptions to this. Two exceptions that tend to act in a more self-interested manner and tend to end up in these arms races, tragedy of the commons type phenomena. One is people who are in dark triad. So people who are more Machiavellian, psychopathic, or narcissistic are usually more likely to defect in the case of a game theoretic experiment. The second is a self-fulfilling prophecy. People who are trained in economics or in finance are far more likely to defect in a game theoretic situation, which makes sense. If you expect everyone else is going to, if you've been trained that way, it becomes a good justification for acting like a bit of a jerk. And I think we kind of have a similar thing when it comes to the agents of doom, when it comes to these artificial agents we've created. They're not artificial in just any kind of bland sense. They're artificial in a very particular sense. They do tend to be much more Machiavellian, much more self-interested, and much more, in a way, rational than most humans are. If I took the United States, the actual government of the United States, and boiled it down to a single person who is stalking the streets outside, what would they be like? They wouldn't be particularly nice, would they? They'd be giving away less than 1% of their income to the less wealthy. They'd be constantly stockpiling weapons, even against their best neighbors. They bully their closest friends. Every second sentence they utter would usually be in some way self-aggrandizing. And if you ran them through a battery psychology test, they probably would rank pretty high on all the dark triad. And I think that's not just true of the US, it's true of most countries around the world. The institutions, the artificial agents we've built up, do not represent the best of us. And they're the actors that tend to end up in these game theoretic races for resources, status, arms. And that's the real conundrum that we find ourselves in.
So then that, to me, raises another conundrum, which is the answer to this to build up human responses to these artificial agents? In a way, one moral that you might draw from the long story that you've been describing across these episodes is there comes a point in the aggrandizement of power, first by individuals, then by groups, then by institutions, and ultimately by these artificial agents, the build-up of power, locating it in places where it eventually feeds off itself, that the resistance has to take the form of human resistance to the symptoms of inhuman behavior. And this can be human sacrifice, flaying your enemies alive, or it can be polluting the planet to the point where it may not be habitable by human beings in the future. And one of the things I've often thought about corporations is they don't think in those terms because they're not human. Corporations actually probably can survive fine in an humanly uninhabitable environment because corporations are actually shells. They're shell entities. So is the solution here to draw on this long, deep history to emphasize the ways in which human beings are capable of escaping and resisting the hold of these structures of power, which essentially bring out the worst in us? We've got to find the best in us to resist that. Or, in the world that we live in now, do we have to face the fact that actually the only agents that are sufficiently powerful to take on these agents of doom are themselves Leviathans? In the sense that if we think that what's wrong is the game, the only agents that are powerful enough to change the rules of the game are not us. They are actually states. And if some of the villains of this piece are these corporations, actually we have got to, as human beings, empower our states to take them down, because we're not going to be able to do it ourselves. This is not ancient Assyria. This is not even ancient Rome. Dispersal and depopulation won't do it. There are strategies that you might say are equivalent. If we all simultaneously withdrew our custom from the big technology companies, if there was a global boycott of their products, it would destroy them. But it's not going to happen. It's not the same as living in a city where you've had enough of the leaders sacrificing your children, flaying people alive, and you just get up, pack your things and walk out. Our world is so interconnected, there is nowhere to walk out to. The idea that we withdraw our customs from these corporations and somehow this could be a global event seems to me as fantastical as anything. So my instinct is that actually this is not, we need to remember that human beings can take these things down. We now live in a world where actually the only things that can take these things down are things like them. And in the end, actually, it's the state or the Leviathan that has to take down the corporation. And without wanting to bring it all back to Hobbes, that was why Hobbes thought we needed Leviathans. He thought we needed the power of the state because otherwise we would be at the mercy of what he called corporations.
I think it's both, ultimately. We probably do need these artificial agents in some way to have cooperation at a sufficient scale to essentially exist in the world as 8 billion people. However, we need to rehumanize these artificial agents, whether it be Leviathans, whether it be corporations, even whether it be AI systems, for instance. It comes down to a question of why the artificial agent's behaving this way. And I think part of this is a selection mechanism that, as I've mentioned before, over time, we've tended to select for people who both want status and also are more willing to go to greater lengths to get it as well. So we tend to be selecting for status seekers. We also, because of that, tend to select for the dark triad. And on top of that, even when good people and competent people get into power, they often do get corrupted by power. That selection effect then creates feedback loops, ideologies, customs, etc., which tend to make things worse. So we kind of accept at this stage that states are just going to act in a very self-interested, ruthless fashion. And same with corporations as well. We almost just take that as part of the deal at this stage. We need to find a way to break that selection mechanism. And I think in many ways is simply re-democratize the Leviathan, break the Goliath. When you look at what average people think about global risks, so when you go to a survey on should we ban lethal autonomous weapons, killer robots, the strong majority across most countries says yes. Even if you look at, say, for instance, should we be taking more action on climate change and have a carbon price? Again, majority, even in places like Australia and the US, say yes. Across the board, in general, if you aligned the general perception and opinion with policy, you'd probably have less global risk. On top of that, we have these things called deliberative assemblies and juries. Basically, you work by lottery, as ancient Athens did. You randomly select people. You get them briefed by experts. They get given time to deliberate. That seems to both reduce polarization within their groups, but often they come to pretty good conclusions as well. This helped to solve the abortion debate in Ireland. In France, they had the French Climate Assembly, which actually crafted a really strong overall climate policy package, which Macron then declined to adopt because, in essence, it was too ambitious and too progressive. When we say Leviathan or when we say Goliath or anything like that, artificial agent, it becomes a question of how inclusive are they and how democratically tethered are they? I think the key going forward is to make sure they're put back under democratic control. And to put this into a bigger context, it's worthwhile remembering that if we don't, as you already kind of alluded to, there's a good chance that these things are quite happy to leave us behind. One of the biggest ideologies in Silicon Valley right now is the idea of accelerationism. And the key arch prophet of that is Nick Land. Interesting guy, but his key idea was that across history, there's a feedback loop between increasing wealth and technology and increasing power. One begets the other, and that is creating this force of what he calls techno-capital, which will eventually eat the world and leave humans behind. He's someone who thinks we should accelerate the creation of things like AI systems intentionally because they will destroy democracy and eventually make humans obsolete. That's a philosophy which is largely followed by people like Peter Thiel, people who have immense amounts of power, both in Silicon Valley, but also increasingly in the White House as well. In some ways, this is a pretty grand story of do we learn to control and democratize Goliaths and Leviathans, or do they potentially eat us and leave us behind?
When we started these conversations, and the first question I asked you is, what is the default of human social organization? And you said it is democracy. That was the very first thing you said. Egalitarian democracy in hunter-gatherer societies. But on a tiny scale, I mean, we are talking about maximum thousands, in many cases hundreds of people. But if people operate in that scale, other things being equal, they will naturally organize themselves in a way that is collaborative and does not create hierarchies of power or domination. We are now talking about a global Goliath of 8 billion people and profoundly interconnected, which, as you said, needs to be re-democratized. Now, there is some consolation in the thought that maybe the default condition of human societies is democracy. So the momentum is with re-democratization if we can just get back in touch with who we really are. But for me, the barrier of scale is so enormous here in the sense that, yes, I can see this. Even deliberative assemblies are scaling these things down. Then the question is how you plug them into the Leviathan. But on a scale of hundreds or thousands, it's very conceivable that we could have much more radically democratic ways of making collective decisions. But absent the complete fragmentation of this system to make that possible, my fear is that we can do it on the scale of the hunter-gatherers in a world in which things to that scale simply get crushed. And I'm not sure what it means to re-democratize, in that sense, a modern state. I've talked a lot about this on this podcast. I think there are many radical experiments we could take with democracy that get us beyond representative democracy, and we are incredibly unimaginative in how we think about the limits of democracy. But when we're thinking about this in existential terms, I do find myself bumping up against the thought that even if it's the default for people who are not like us. We have become something else. We have become a species that operates to a scale where that kind of democracy is almost meaningless. So tell me that I'm wrong. I mean, I genuinely want you to. I mean, I'm not saying that in that kind of, slightly passive aggressive way. I genuinely mean it. I would like to be persuaded that I'm wrong.
Well, first of all, when we think about democracy, it almost always is, above a certain scale, working for representation, right? Like right now, we do have elected officials, and even in the case of having a deliberative assembly or jury, you are also having a form of representation. That group, in some ways, is supposed to be standing in for the rest of the polis. There's a couple of reasons to think that this form of representation does work better, and in some ways is much more democratic as well. One is the selection pressure. You're selecting at random rather than necessarily selecting people who want power and are the ones who are good at getting it. And once again, you're not selecting for things like the dark triad necessarily. The second is that we tend to be pretty good at talking to each other, at deliberating. It's one of the key findings of a lot of these experiments is people often are willing to change their mind when they're put into a small group and given good evidence. And unsurprisingly, when you get people into a small group like that, with prolonged social contact, they tend to usually like each other, or at the very least tolerate and respect each other. And there are numerous examples of this with deliberative assemblies and juries, where you get Democrats and Republicans together. At first, they're at each other's throats. By the end, they're actually getting along pretty well. And they may still disagree on some fundamental policy issues, but they understand and respect where the other person's coming from. In many ways, what we're doing here is we're still using representation, but we're tapping into the better angels of our nature rather than the darker angels. We're tapping into our ability to connect, to deliberate, to change our minds, to depolarize, rather than selecting for status-seeking, dark triad, power corrupting, etc. Now, if you want to go beyond representation, this is probably where new technology can help quite substantially. AI, for instance, there's platforms like Polis, different platforms which try to more or less agglomerate and select for what seems to be the majority opinion within a group, but also sometimes allowing for better deliberation within groups as well. And finding out where are the points of divergence and why within a particular population. It's worthwhile bearing in mind, and you've already alluded to this, that we're not even trying at this stage. The amount of money we spend on improving our democracy would be at least 100 less than what we spend on improving facial recognition and mass surveillance systems. In economics, that's what we call revealed preferences. Despite all the talk of we are here to defend democracy and the free world, and that's why we need to go to often build AI systems against China, etc., that's clearly not the underlying value here. And instead, if we aligned and put our money where our mouth is, I think you can come up with some pretty incredible innovations in democracy. To me, that's probably the strongest argument at this stage, is that We already have some very promising innovations that we aren't doing at scale yet, and we haven't even tried. If we actually put the full might of human innovation and ingenuity to this problem, I think we'd actually find some pretty radical, increasingly interesting ways to re-democratize our leviathans and artificial agents.
And do you think that includes re-democratizing the corporations as well? So we tend to think of these things as the things that we would do to moderate or modify or improve the democratic systems within states. In the history of democracy and democratic thought, for a long time, a lot of hope was placed actually in democratizing non-state institutions, from the family all the way up to the super powerful corporation. And another way in which our political imaginations have shrunk is that when we talk about democracy, we almost always just mean what states do. As you've said, one feature of our world is that states are just one player in a global system in which they are often actually subsidiaries to other systems which dominate them. They are all very dependent on the technologies that are supplied to them, not by their own workers, but by private corporations. Do you think the idea or ideal of democratizing those giant corporations is one that is plausible, realistic in our world? It feels a little utopian. Those Silicon Valley types, including people like Nick Land, they like to talk about actually creating a world which is less like a state and more like a corporation. But because what they like about corporations is that they're not democratic, they are highly autocratic. But you could turn that on its head and say, given we live in a world that is so dominated by corporate power, we should be thinking harder, not just how do we democratize our states, but how we democratize our corporations.
I agree completely. Democracy, once again, is a spectrum of more or less inclusive, deliberative practices and sharing of power. That's something which applies not just to states, but also to corporations, even to families. These things can be more or less democratic. And when we think about a society, we have to ask, how democratic is it across these different areas? If you're voting once every 4 years, but you're working 9 to 5 in an autocracy, are you really living in that much of a democracy? If your markets are still dominated by the hands of a few small, very rich players, essentially in a very autocratic way, how democratic is the economic system? And I actually think in some ways it may be easier to democratize these than to democratize the state to start with. If I was a strategist, one of the things I'd try to do here is actually put in place a citizens' jury assembly or some kind of democratic control over a corporation or set of corporations that people just generally don't really like much right now. A good example would be AI. People, when you do surveys, don't usually like the idea of trying to build artificial general intelligence systems. They're terrified of losing their jobs. They often don't trust the companies, which makes sense given their track record thus far. So try to democratize those first and then use that as a wedge to democratize systems more widely. But when we think about this from a first principles approach, we've said that both states, corporations, even AI systems are all examples of artificial agents. And they all behave in a particularly similar way, which is not representative of the best of us because of the selection process and the evolutionary process they've been put through. If we think democratization will work for states, it should work for the others as well. And when I think of the benefits of democracy, there's kind of two big categories here. One is just the simple moral argument that if we're collectively part of an enterprise, we have a collective say. The second is that democracy is better at making decisions for a raft of different reasons, but one of the ones I'm familiar with because I have a background in doing things like foresight and forecasting is that when you try to make predictions about the future, for instance, you want to have larger groups of people exchanging lots of different sources of information. A prediction market essentially always beats one individual making a guess about the future. And what's even better than prediction markets is having things like super forecasters where you select for people who are particularly good at making predictions. But again, in big groups, they share information. In general, having an adequate level of diversity and deliberation tends to result in better decisions being made. And if we think that the best way to navigate artificial agents in a complex environment is through democracy, then why would that apply to states but not to corporations? It should equally apply to both. I think the reason we don't think about corporations in this democratic way is just purely path dependency and historical contingency. There's nothing particularly rational about it. So yes, I'd try to democratize essentially all of it. I'd see this as being the big challenge we have going forward the 21st century. Is how do we put all these different infrastructures of power back under democratic control.
So I think I know what the CEOs, the psychopathic CEOs of these big corporations would say back to you in response to that argument, which is, we already have such a democratic forum for predicting the future in our world. It is called the market. That in human history, the one really scalable version of that is what usually gets called free markets. And the markets have expressed their view of the future. The psychopathic CEO would say, they valued my company at $4 trillion. Billions of people, at least tens of millions of people, exchanging views about the future have come to a view that Alphabet, I think it's actually dipped just under 4 trillion as we record, but roughly is worth $4 trillion. And so the only version of that that works to scale is the market. The market is basically a prediction forum using tens, hundreds of millions of pieces of information and data coming from all sorts of sources in order to make a bet on the future. Now, I know what I think about that argument, which is I think it's a fraudulent argument because actually I think too much of what is being described there has already been captured by these structures of power. And the reason that Alphabet is being valued at $4 trillion is not simply because free people freely exchanging their views have come to a view about the future, but because too much of that free exchange of views has already been captured by Alphabet and their equivalent. But there is an argument there about scale. We create our little deliberative assemblies, and our deliberative assemblies say, we want to regulate these giant corporations. And then there is this other kind of deliberative entity, the market, which is giving a different view. And again, I worry that these arguments really do work, but that they get crushed by the scale of our world. And it is a psychopathic argument to say that the market has said we're worth $4 trillion, therefore we are the future. That's not a human argument. That's the sort of argument that a corporation would make and someone who's been captured by a corporation. But still, there is the problem of scale. I keep coming back to it. I worry that these things are really hard to scale, these forms of democracy. And if they are going to be representative, so we say we're going to have this citizens' jury as representative in the way that a parliament is representative, it will very soon acquire the characteristics of a parliament. If it's genuinely going to represent 50 million people, actually quite soon you're going to find structures of power and hierarchy building up around it, because it will be such a powerful entity.
First of all, it's worth noting that over 80% of the exchanges made in a stock exchange are actually done by algorithmic systems, not by humans. So it's not particularly human-based in the first place. And the second is that when we talk about democracy, in many ways we're talking about equality of political power. The key thing with these assemblies, with these juries, even with an electoral-based system, is everyone's supposed to have something of an equal voice. In the assembly, it's not like one person is the facilitator who gets to make all the decisions. We do often have professional facilitators, but they actually aren't part of the decision-making process, and that's for a very particular reason. If you had an assembly where only one person was calling the shots at the end, it's not really democratic, is it? And this is the problem with the market, is that the markets do tend to be very fat-tailed. There's a small number of players who have a disproportionate say here. And when you look at something like the valuation of Google, for instance, or OpenAI, it ends up looking pretty fraudulent because you have a couple of big actors, say, for instance, NVIDIA, having deals with OpenAI, which massively inflate themselves. And often OpenAI is buying its own stock in order to inflate its own value too. So ultimately, it's nowhere near democratic because there is no equality of power in the market. Quite to the contrary. And this brings us to this question of what happens if you do have a citizen's assembly or jury kind of replacing parliament? Wouldn't that just get corrupted too eventually? Before we get there, just a little thought experiment I like to always provide because I think it can show the power of how these things could address some of our fundamental problems. And I call it the Trinity jury. It's based upon the Trinity experiment back in 1945. In July in the sands of New Mexico, we detonated the world's very first atomic weapon, the Trinity bomb. The night beforehand, Enrico Fermi, a physicist on the project, was taking bets to the other scientists as to whether or not the bomb would destroy the entire world. That's because one of his colleagues, Edward Teller, had made a calculation that there was a non-zero chance that igniting the bomb would also ignite the atmosphere of Earth, thus killing every single human being and every single shred of life on the planet. By that time, the US also knew that the Nazis were no longer capable of building their own atomic weapon. So this wasn't about beating the Nazis to the bomb. They still went ahead and took that risk. I like to give the thought experiment of, imagine if you had a citizen's jury, if you randomly selected people from across the US at the time, teachers, farmers, cleaners, you gave them the information. You said there's a chance that this could kill literally everyone. It's a very, very small, infinitesimal chance, but nonetheless, there is a probability that occurs. And by the way, we don't need this to beat the Nazis anymore. We know they can't build their own bomb, and they're already about to lose the war. Do we think that jury says, yes, please go ahead and detonate the weapon? And the reaction I get from most people is one of disbelief. Of course they wouldn't. And I think in some way people are tapping into how they would behave if they were part of that jury. So first of all, I do think these things can be quite powerful, even if they aren't the optimum in terms of radical democracy. But I think you're also right that if we had a citizens' jury and assembly operating at multiple different levels of government, but we still had billionaires, they'd probably find a way to hijack the system.
That thought experiment, though, would require one other piece of information. It's not completely clear to me, if you add the extra piece of information, which way it would go. So this is not just about having a bomb before the Nazis. By July 1945, the Nazi regime had collapsed. Part of the argument was, which could be made to farmers and cleaners and others across America, if we have this bomb, we will not have to invade Japan. And if we invade Japan, your sons will die in their millions. And at that point, it's not completely clear to me which way your thought experiment would go. It would very much depend on the quality of the discussion that followed that. Because I can imagine people saying, well, I want to know what you mean by an infinitesimal chance. If we're talking about the high probability that an invasion of Japan would cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers relative to a very, very small chance, and we're talking about our children, I'm not sure. So I'm not sure the way you set it up is completely the whole picture.
Yeah, there is more information here. And similarly, they could also make the argument of, well, we need to get these weapons because at the end of World War II, we have a new enemy emerging, the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is quickly industrializing. They've won the Eastern Front. This could be a new power that we have to arm ourselves against. And of course, this was a justification for the stockpiling of nuclear weapons after the Trinity test. I suspect even in that case that people probably still would have made the decision to not ignite the bomb. And part of this is, even in the case of Japan, it's worth remembering that while the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were absolutely horrendous, more people died in the firebombing of Tokyo. If they really wanted to just simply bomb Japan to smithereens and make sure they didn't have to invade by land or by the Navy, they could have just kept bombing them. And that's something not necessarily I would endorse, but is it really worth potentially destroying the entire world when you have other weapons that could achieve the same outcome? Question mark.
So that presumably would have been the discussion. We're not here to relitigate that question. And actually, we talked about this with Sonia in the previous set of episodes. But to me, what that experiment does is it just suggests how much would depend on the quality of the information that people were given. You can imagine, quote unquote, experts presenting evidence to such a jury in such a way that it isn't a foregone conclusion that people wouldn't risk the end of everything. But I think I agree with you that were it presented in as dispassionate a way as possible, it seems unlikely that people would run that risk.
I mean, a much clearer cut example here, as I mentioned in the 1970s, different fossil fuel companies, including Exxon, having information about climate change, that it was occurring and that could cause great damage going into the future, and them intentionally bearing the information and then funneling tens of millions of dollars into misinformation and disinformation campaigns to cast doubt in the science of climate change. I suspect if you had a citizens' jury there, that they too probably would have said, I would prefer if you don't lie to my friends and family and continuously pollute the environment in such a way that could potentially kill my grandkids. But I think you're still right here. But, a lot of this does depend upon how you choose the experts, how you do facilitation, etc. And this is something that's widely recognized in the study of deliberative democracy as well, which brings us back to, I think you have to level the other forms of power. If you have deliberative juries and assemblies, but you still have billionaires, they'll probably find a way to rig the system a bit eventually. And likewise, if you have small cadres of increasingly powerful bureaucracies who are the ones organizing the experts organizing the process and then not being continuously recycled in some way, you probably get some kind of corruption by power. You'll get the status seekers going into that instead. So, unfortunately, I think the project here is actually even deeper than just doing radical democracy. I think we need to level most of the forms of power we have across the world, including economic power. How do we level power to make sure that realistically everyone is a bit more free and we can actually do proper democracy, and then see what kind of social forms we come up with? But the problem here, of course, is even if we get one country to do that, how do we ensure they're not eaten by another one who's less democratic? It's putting all of this into the bigger evolutionary story we've spoken about. So across this podcast series, we've spoken about how we went from being a nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers to increasingly dominance-based hierarchical societies into larger and larger empires. And across the great span, we've had both an increase in the size of our empires and our Goliaths, but we've also had an increase in their ability to control larger groups of people. And this, in part, is why we've ended up with the states we have today and why states have taken over the world. There's a second part to this. How long do nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers last? How long do the earliest cities of the world last? How long do empires and states throughout history last? Over time, there seems to be accelerating death of social systems. So nomadic egalitarians, when you look at material culture, they seem to last for hundreds of thousands of years in some cases, like with the Khoisan, without having any big abrupt changes to material culture. The very early settlements of the world often persist for thousands of years, which is just almost unthinkable now. When you get the first empires coming up, suddenly they start to die off more quickly. And as you go along throughout history, it appears that in general, empires and states start to last a little bit less long. In the modern world, we have noted that European states in particular seem to be particularly long-lived, which is true. That isn't true for the rest of the world. When you look at colonization, there is an enormous increase in state death. And apart from this period post-1945, there actually was a very large amount of state death during the 19th century, for instance. Hence, you seem to have this acceleration. And the key explanation behind all these big changes we see is competition. Now, you basically have increasing competition between Goliaths. The ones that succeed are the ones that are bigger and better at military domination. That's why we remember Rome, but we don't remember the Celts or the Etruscans. And that also causes this continuous churn, but also an acceleration of risk over time. And this is the big problem going forward as well, is how do we make sure we can make these changes to our artificial agents, we can democratize them, but don't be eaten by another country who doesn't.
But isn't there another problem here? If the goal is leveling and inequality, rising inequality is the thing that has to be overcome, we also have all of the historical evidence that you have been talking about over the course of these conversations, which is that you do get leveling, but leveling tends to go along with collapse. So the thing that you have been describing we need to do is somehow level it without collapsing it, because to collapse this thing could be extremely dangerous. So what we need to do is level it so that it can be better regulated and better run for the humans who inhabit this global Goliath, this global Leviathan. But the historical evidence suggests that actually the great leveler, to borrow a phrase from an author you've already mentioned, his book Escape from Rome, Walter Scheidel, but also his book The Great Leveler. In that book, he argues there is really only one great leveler in history, and it's war. It's war and social failure, because that does wipe out huge amounts of wealth and it has a leveling effect. You've been describing all sorts of leveling events, but these leveling events are themselves collapses. So there isn't really any historical evidence of how we do it in the absence of collapse. Of course, social democracy in the first half and the second half of the 20th century made some strides in levelling societies that had become pretty unequal. But as you've just said, in the broad sweep of history, these are blinks of an eye, these moments of levelling. And actually, the 30 or 40 years didn't last. We've gone back to rampant inequality. The real levelling effect comes from social collapse. So without wanting to be too gloomy, I'm not sure I'm convinced that there is any evidence for how we do it voluntarily, collectively, because the better angels of our nature allow us to see the path ahead, rather than it's going to take something pretty bad happening, and then we might be able to start again.
They call me Dr. Doom, and yet you've been even darker here, David. But you are right, first of all. Walter, he actually identifies 4 different great levelers. These are mass mobilization warfare, a bloody revolution, a particularly severe pandemic, or state collapse, societal collapse. Those are the 4 big forces that tend to level and reverse wealth inequality. In the absence of those 4, you tend to get increasing wealth inequality within a polity. That's for very simple reasons. One is simply that, in general, capital increases more quickly in value than wages do. And the second one is one we've spoken about a fair few times already: power begets more power. The catch here is that when you look across Walter's great levelers, he often describes violence as the key thing here, that it's really about violence and a loss of life. But that doesn't really seem to be true per se. If we look at, say, for instance, a pandemic, there's not really any violence caused per se. It's really about the fatality increasing the bargaining power of workers. That's what happens in the wake of the Black Death. You have fewer laborers, and hence their labor becomes much more valuable. They have more bargaining power relative to their employers. And that's really the key behind all the great levelers, is they redistribute power and increase the bargaining power of the average individual. And even when we look at, say, for instance, the theories as to why you have widespread democratization along with the Industrial Revolution, almost all the theories point to a similar dynamic of you have increasing bargaining power on behalf of the masses. Will that be due to things like education, greater collective bargaining through unions, or potentially even the world wars and the fact that suddenly people are armed and the state's increasingly dependent upon mass mobilized warfare? In every single case, it's the redistribution of power. There are some exceptions, and you mentioned one of these, kind of rise of social welfare democracies. In particular, Scheidel points towards, I believe it's Sweden in the interbellum years, essentially seems to have a leveling effect largely through a whole bunch of parliamentary reforms, I think including the rise of unions, but without the violence. And another one he points to is ancient Athens stops wealth inequality from rising through the institution of its unique deliberative democracy. But those are admittedly the exceptions here. Overall, I'm pretty pessimistic about the future going forwards. I explicitly don't try to make any predictions or numerical quantitative forecasts about the future, namely because I don't think we can do that. When we look at super forecasters, for instance, who are the absolute gold standard at doing predictive forecasts, they win all the intelligence agency forecasting tournaments. They don't have a very good track record if you go beyond a year. Their accuracy degrades very, very quickly. And importantly, they're usually making forecasts about very bounded, clear issues. Things like who's going to win the next election, for instance, or will there be conflict above X number of casualties? They're usually not making very big, complex issues a topic of forecasting, like will there be societal collapse? Hence, I don't trust anyone who tries to put a quantitative forecast here, let alone myself doing it. What we can do, I think, is understand the dynamics across history and what kind of trajectories that is putting us towards. I think in the short term, it's probably what I call Silicon Goliath, essentially a world of increasingly powerful, unequal states, but ones that move back towards the historical average of being more predatory, hierarchical, unequal, and less good for their citizens, but potentially more materially powerful. In the longer term, I think by far the most likely outcome, for all the reasons we've discussed, including the acceleration of impacts on the Earth system, as well as the acceleration of our own societies, the development of increasingly destructive weapons and destructive capabilities in general. In the long term, the most likely trajectory is self-termination. Goliath destroys itself. And I'm not sure if that'll be decades or if it'll take longer, potentially centuries, but I do think in the longer term, that's the most likely outcome here. There is still that small, very off chance that we manage to use a unique combination of our knowledge of history, our new improving technology, and potentially even the populist fervor we see across many countries to have a shift towards increasingly democratic, egalitarian societies. But I think as we can clearly see, that's a bit of a long shot. I don't think it's likely, but in many ways that makes it even more worth fighting for.
And when you say self-termination, the Goliath destroys itself. The Goliath is not a human. The Goliath is a superhuman artificial entity. When it destroys itself, do we survive that?
This entirely depends on how it all plays out. I can imagine a scenario here in which you mainly have a soft landing where fossil fuels, their energy ratio goes down and down and becomes increasingly difficult to run a global industrialized society. Quality of life dips continuously over the space of decades, industries fall apart. And on top of that, you probably start to have increasing amounts of civil wars, coups, rebellions, etc. And eventually end up in a world which is probably more egalitarian, but also has a lower standard of living across the board. And I can also imagine worlds where you have nuclear war combined with very high levels of warming across the world. And that combination potentially is enough to cause either very large losses of life across the world and potentially the very worst cases, human extinction. But it's worthwhile noting that extinction here is an incredibly high bar. We are, despite everything that happens to us, remarkably resilient. It's worth bearing in mind that even after a nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a day later they had a bank running. Within a few days, they had electricity running through, I think, a third of the city. We as a species are remarkably resilient. Despite all the collapses across world history, despite colonization, travesties, warfare, genocide, across history you see population going up in an exponential sense. So extinction's a very high bar, but if we have Goliath destroy itself and we can't find a new energy source like fossil fuels, maybe that means we're kind of, not going to say trapped, but we have to stay in some kind of social forms limited to Earth, which to me is actually not a big deal. I quite like Earth. But to some people, that may seem like a death sentence in the very, very long term.
So we don't end on the most pessimistic note. That soft landing, can you see it playing out in ways that echo some of the collapses that you've described from earlier in human history? It's a soft landing on some measures. The standard of living goes down. We are not as wealthy as we were, but maybe we're healthier, maybe we're happier, maybe we are more democratic. That there are ways in which, even though this is such an interwoven, tightly connected global system, as it disintegrates, we end up better off.
There is some chance of that, yes. When we look at, say, for instance, recessions, there's really mixed health impacts here. In general, recessions often cause an increase in life expectancy. This is for a range of reasons, including there tends to be less traffic, less air pollution. People tend to have less money to buy what we call sin stocks, so alcohol, tobacco, etc. People often have more time to socialize and to exercise, which are very important in terms of life expectancy. However, there are costs. So rates of suicide, for instance, and mental health and depression tend to skyrocket, particularly amongst men. So there's always going to be a mixed record here, but sometimes things like recessions aren't necessarily always just a bad thing. And when we think about having a lower standard of living, there's actually some good things here as well. And I've already kind of touched upon some of them, less air pollution, for instance, people having more time to spend with loved ones, even if you do have a less income overall, potentially having more equal societies. When we look at the field of what's called degrowth, and that's a kind of rough idea of let's degrow the economy, at least in high-income countries, to make sure we stay within planetary boundaries. Usually, one of the key points they make is that you don't need to have really powerful economies in order to have happier people. Portugal has, I think, 60% of the GDP per capita of the US, and yet it ranks higher on essentially every single quality of life indicator. If you're going to choose just simply where you would have a better life, particularly if you're not a rich person, you choose Portugal over the US. Hence, a lot of this ends up being about how we organize ourselves, what we prioritize in life, and many of those things don't require enormous amounts of riches. And when we look at happiness studies, whether it's particularly life experiential, where essentially you ask people throughout the course of a day, how are you feeling right now on a scale of 1 to 10? When you look at different industrialized countries like Spain and the US, and if you compare that to the Hadza of Tanzania, group of nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers who have been in the area for tens of thousands of years, the Hadza are by far the happiest. When you look across the great time span of history here, there's some chance that despite all the enormous material progress we've had, despite the fact that we now know what stars are, that we can send a spacecraft out to distant planets, the average person may not necessarily be happier. They may actually be overall be a bit sadder.
So I think the moral that I'm going to draw from that, I'm not sure I can quite do the stretch and hope that we end up as hunter-gatherers, but my hope is that the end of the world means we all end up as Portugal. We do hope you've enjoyed this series. I have found it fascinating, I have to say, and eye-opening in all sorts of ways. And there is a bonus episode to accompany it, which will be out tomorrow on PPF+. As with our series with Paul Sagar, we're calling it The Personal and the Political. I'm talking to Luke Kemp about his story, how he came to be interested in this subject, and how he's changed his mind about some of the things that he thinks might happen. It starts in rural Australia. It takes in, among other things, organised crime. If you would like to hear what I think is a really interesting conversation, you know what to do. Click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com, and sign up now to PPF+. You will get that episode, all of our bonus episodes, past, present and future, ad-free listening, automatic sign-up to our newsletter, never have to hear these messages again, all for £5 a month or £50 for the year, and we really value your support. Also, a quick reminder that if you would like to join us for a special LRB event this Wednesday at Friends House in London, I'm going to be talking to, among others, Lise Doucette, the BBC's international correspondent, about the fate of democracy. Lise Doucette was in Tehran just a few weeks ago, and she will be helping us try to understand what is going on in Iran now and what it means for the rest of the world. Tickets are still available. Go to lrb.me/democracy or click on the link in the show description. Next time in our regular slot, it's the return of our occasional series with the historian Robert Saunders that we call Now and Then, and it commemorates significant anniversaries. This time, it's the 80th anniversary of Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.